As many of you probably know, there's been an enormous amount of research on language development in humans. You know what? A lot of that actually has originated from studies involving birdsong learning, both in terms of production and perception. And in fact, a lot of neuroscience research has involved the study of birdsong learning in relationship to the various brain areas that control it. So we're going to be looking at birdsong learning in a little bit of detail. And in this segment, we're going to focus primarily on how it develops in songbirds. Now, many of you think, oh, well, those are some interesting bird songs. None of those were bird songs. Those were calls. Most researchers distinguish calls from songs. Calls tend to have a somewhat simpler structure than the complexity of song that we see in songbirds. We've seen a lot of examples of calls already. We've looked at alarm calls, for example. We've looked at food calls, a whole variety of calls. But song is considerably more complex and is typically reserved for males who are setting up and then defending their territories and then subsequently courting females, whereas calls have a variety of other functions, like alarming for predators, for example. Now, this is an example of a song in a chestnut-sided warbler. As songs go, that's pretty simple. Let's slow it down. Maybe you can get a little better idea about the complexity. So let's look at it still in a little bit more detail. This is slowed down considerably, and by looking at the sound spectrograph and following along, you'll be able to get a better appreciation of the vocal gymnastics that this bird is going through to produce something this complex in real time. So this is slowed down. We cannot do anything like that. Our vocal organ will not enable us to do something like that. There is very complex frequency modulations going on in these various notes. The wood thrush is among the champions of complex songs. So the sonogram on the bottom shows a whole song and many parts repeat. First, let's listen to it in normal speed. But to gain a better idea of the complexity of what this bird is actually doing, let's slow it down. So each of those individual notes are grouped into syllables, and then you can see the spaces between the syllables, and then you put them all together and you have this one song bout. But notice that there is rhyme and reason to what this bird is actually doing. It's not just randomly producing these sounds. There is intentional repetition. So, for example, notice these notes right here. I'll just play those real quick. And notice how those repeat further on in the song, like over here. And notice how they repeat yet again down near the end over there. And okay, not that last part, but I want to point out about that last part that notice that there's repetition there as well. So here we see right over here, we get that almost buzzing type sound. It's really a very complex trill. And then we get another version of it over here. And then yet another version of it over here. And then finally at the end of the song bout, which is right over there. And I won't go through everything, but there are other elements here that repeat in a very meaningful fashion. So it's not just about producing random sounds. There's definite patterns, and what some researchers have done with a variety of species is to take recordings of songs like this and chop them up and reverse the order or just put the notes in random order and see whether or not it loses its effect on the listener, which would typically be either another male in a territorial situation or a female in a courtship situation. And it depends on the species. Sometimes rearranging the syllables matters, and sometimes it doesn't. But there's an awful lot of information conveyed within these series of sounds, including species identification. I'm a wood thrush. The individual that's singing it. I'm George the wood thrush, or whoever. And, whether or not they might even be of a healthier status than others, there's all kinds of things that the bird is doing by singing these very complex songs. How do they do it? They do it with an area. I won't even call it an organ. It's really not a separate organ as such. It's where the trachea meets the two bronchi that then branch off going to either lung. And it's called the syrinx, S-Y-R-I-N-X. And it looks like that. So what we have here is the trachea. So that's going to go up, 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 all the way to the mouth. So this is pretty deep inside the bird, okay? And then here's one bronchi that's going to go to one lung and the other one going to the other lung. And notice there's an enlargement, and those are the membranes that actually vibrate to produce sound. And if we look at it here in cross-section, trachea, bronchi, bronchi, membranes right there. So that's basically what's making all of that complexity happen, as well as the simple calls that birds utter. And of course, everything is controlled by nuclei, groups of cell bodies in the brain that are responsible for song production as well as song perception. And some of the nuclei are involved in both production and perception. And the main ones that are involved are here. HVC is probably the most studied. It stood originally for a very long word, hyperventralis something or other, and it got so studied that people have just renamed it and call it higher vocal center, HVC. I can't think of any other situation in neuroscience where that kind of renaming has taken place. It's just that the original name was so long and cumbersome that they decided, higher vocal center. And that, MAN in another important area, area X, RA. These have been the primary ones that have been studied. This one down here. And then we go to the hypoglossus nerves that then go down to the syrinx, where they control muscles that control the membranes of the syrinx. And so that's laid out like this. There's the syrinx, so you can see the trachea. There's the left and right hypoglossus nerves that are coming out of the brain. There's the trachea there, the two bronchi that go to the lungs. And so the hypoglossus nerves are coming down, and they're going to be controlling the muscles that then control the membranes of the syrinx. So basically what's going on is, as the bird is expelling air from its lungs, the air is going to hit these membranes right here that are controlled by the muscles, that are controlled by the hypoglossus, that is controlled by nuclei in the brain. And we have these membranes here that'll vibrate when they're pulled inward by the muscles. I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. And then you have the other set over here that do the same thing. And basically, the name of these membranes, they are pretty important because they're the ones that are really responsible for all these sounds. This is the external tympaniform membrane, the internal tympaniform membrane. Same on this side, external tympaniform membrane and internal. So here we have a live bird that is under local anesthesia so that the surgery could be done to expose the syrinx. And this is when the bird is not vocalizing. So notice these membranes are just kind of hanging loose, okay? The air is coming through that bronchi, and then out when it is vocalizing, but it's not. It's only breathing right now. And when it's breathing, you don't hear sound other than, like what your dog does or what we do, whatever, or an obscene phone call or whatever. But now, when it starts to produce sound, notice where those membranes go. The muscles that are controlled by the hypoglossus nerve, that are controlled by the brain, are now pulling these membranes inward. They're not hanging loose anymore. So when they're inward, the air can now hit them, and of course with the same with the externals, which we can't see here, hit these membranes and they start to vibrate on both sides. And then the sound is then going to go up the trachea, where there's further resonance that's created by the trachea, which will vary from species to species, that will then also add somewhat to the complexity of the sound. But the main basis of the complexity itself is really at the syrinx. Also, those two sets of membranes, the internal and the internal tympaniform membranes, probably the externals as well, a little bit of controversy there, but most likely it is both sets, are capable of producing sounds independently on either side. So in essence, what I'm saying is the air that's passing along and hitting these membranes on this side can produce one tone, and this one can produce a totally different tone at the exact same point in time, which is really, really unique and adds even more to the vocal complexity of birdsong. We call this the two-voice phenomenon, and here it is demonstrated in a canary.
A bird's voice box can also produce two different notes simultaneously. It's not high in the throat like ours, but deep in its chest. Low notes come from one side, high from the other. By alternating between high and low notes, even short songs can carry very complex messages. And this is the champion. The cowbird uses over 40 different notes in his songs. Some of them are so high that they are beyond the hearing of many of us. Once again, if we slow the action down, we can hear what's going on. The left side is producing the low notes, and the right, the high. Others are made by combining the sounds higher up in the throat. It may take a cowbird 2 years to learn his song properly.
So you'll notice that a song bout in a cowbird is relatively short compared to what you heard in the canary and certainly the wood thrush. But the complexity is enormous, and there's two-voice phenomena going on in many places of the cowbird song. Okay, so how does all this develop? Well, here we have a songbird. It's going to hatch. Okay, and typically that's going to happen, we'll just say in early spring, because that's, at least when the first brood would emerge. So for the first 5 weeks of life, what you hear are nestling and fledgling food-begging calls, distress calls if they're cold, maybe what some people call contentment calls if they're nice and warm and cozy, whatever. But they're very simple calls. They're often scratchy sounding. In fact, they sound like this. Oh, by the way, we're listening to a western meadowlark for this example. So here we have these very crude calls. Just a lot of buzzing, really. Nothing really complex there at all. Now, in their first summer, okay, as we go along this developmental timeline, they'll start to incorporate other kinds of calls, but also sort of start engaging in what's called subsong, because you start to hear a little bit more frequency modulated tones in subsong, but it's really just a rambling on and on and on and on with no patterning and hardly any spacing, no syllables per se. It sounds pretty much like this. So, they fledged from the nest by this point, and they're really not singing. They're not even reproductively capable quite yet. So they're just kind of doing that kind of song production stuff called subsong. But then something interesting happens in the fall and winter, which is now outside of the reproductive season, okay? Because that won't happen until next spring. But now they're just going to continue along with more subsong, kind of elaborating on that more and more, but it's still going to ramble on and on and on. But then something even more interesting happens. In very early spring, we see a change. It's called plastic song. Now there's going to be more patterning of these various notes. It's not their courtship song yet, but there certainly is more rhyme and reason to this in terms of how the elements are patterned and distributed, as we hear right now. Now, what's going on in plastic song, they're overproducing the kinds of sounds that they will ultimately end up using in their full adult courtship and territorial songs. So they go through a process in summer, their first summer, called song crystallization. So we start with the overproduction of syllables that occurs in plastic song, but then an attrition of many of them that drop out. And once the ones that will not be used drop out, they undergo attrition, what's left is, guess what? The full adult song, which in this species sounds like this. Okay, so now they are ready to set up territories. Now, in many species, they might not start to do that until their second summer, but, this is their second summer. It really depends on when they actually hatched, how early in the breeding season, whether or not they will delay reproduction for, I guess, what would typically be their third summer. But many of them will actually start to try to set up territories in that very first summer. It's going to vary from species to species. It also depends on whether we're dealing with nest helpers or not. We saw nest helpers in another segment. So, again, western meadowlark, here it is with sound spectrograms. Subsong, just rambling on and on and on. Now here's plastic song, and you'll see the patterning. then song crystallization, and what we're left with is adult song. Okay, now about the brain and those nuclei. I don't know everyone's background in this course. Anyone that has had Psych 1100 will know what I'm about to say, but I'm going to have to just quickly describe what we are looking at here for those who have not. Okay, we're looking at dendrites. Dendrites are parts of neurons where incoming information from other neurons typically occurs. And you notice the little nubs on each of these dendrites. So the branches are the dendrites. And then each of them have these little nubs on them. They're called dendritic spines. The more dendritic spines you have, the more connections can be made with other neurons, meaning the greater the complexity of the connections. You have trillions, literally trillions of these connections in your brain. And songbirds have smaller brains, so they might not have trillions, but probably billions, I would imagine. But, the more the better. This is a case where more is good. And on top of that, the larger the spines, the better, because larger spines maintain their connections for a longer period of time. A smaller spine might make a connection, but then it might break away. So we see some really small spines, but then we also see some really nice large ones. So large is good here as well. More is good, large is good. So a young bird is typically going to be learning its song, or parts of its song at least, from its father singing. And as that's happening, so the onset of song learning, what that actually is going to do is induce more dendritic spine growth and larger dendritic spines for more stable connections. This has been looked at in great detail in the zebrafinch. So there we have an adult, and there we have over on the right, we have a very young bird. It's not reached adulthood, but it's listening to its father sing. So it's going to be the onset of song learning. There are the various brain nuclei involved. And if we start to look at the dendrites and dendritic spines in some of these nuclei, here's what we see. So in this figure here, pre-tutoring, before the bird has been listening to its father, there are dendritic spines. Okay, so that's good. I mean, they would normally be there anyway. But look what happens after tutoring has occurred and it's really starting to learn its song. We have a larger dendritic spine relative to the one here, and we have more dendritic spines than we had here. So let me point those out. There's new spines. There's one there. See, it's missing before tutoring. There's another one. That's a larger spine, rather. There's a larger spine. And compare that to the smaller version pre-tutoring. And there are other spines. So I'm not going to point out every little spine, for God's sakes. And then from the same study, here we have up above, before learning, you see very small nubs. I wouldn't even call them spines yet. And then after learning, we have the actual development of spines down below, and they're actually pretty good ones in terms of their size. So again, the more connections, especially in the song production nuclei in the brain, the more complex the song is going to be, the faster the learning might be. There's all kinds of things here involved in the brain that ultimately are controlling the hypoglossus nerve, that controls the muscles, that control the syrinx, and therefore results in bird song. And once again, you can see them here. We have pre-tutoring. There is a not too bad spine, but it's actually gotten larger there. You may not be able to see it, but people have done very detailed measurements. And the same thing over here. Smaller, larger. This one's a little bit easier to see by comparison. Okay, those are some of the basics about song learning.